He was never in the wrong place. That was the first thing people noticed about him after the fact. Every crime he committed happened in a space where his presence was entirely legitimate. Every forgery he produced used materials he was authorized to handle. Every deception he ran exploited a relationship that was, on its surface, exactly what it appeared to be. His name was Herennius Siculus, and in the final decades of the Roman Republic, he built a criminal operation so sophisticated, so deeply embedded in the legal and financial infrastructure of Roman society, that the institutions designed to catch him were the same institutions he was using to commit his crimes. To understand how this was possible, you have to understand how Roman financial and legal life actually functioned. The Roman Republic did not have banks in the modern sense. It had argentarii, money changers and financial intermediaries who facilitated loans, currency exchange, and the management of large financial transactions. These were not peripheral figures. They were central to Roman commercial life, operating from fixed locations in the Forum, keeping detailed records, and functioning as the connective tissue of an economy that ran on trust, reputation, and the reliability of written documentation. Historian Jean Andreau, in his foundational work on banking and financial life in ancient Rome, has described how the argentarius occupied a unique position at the intersection of money, law, and social obligation. They witnessed contracts, they authenticated transactions, they held deposits, and managed estates. Their records were legally admissible as evidence in Roman courts, and their professional reputation was both their primary asset and their primary vulnerability. Herennius Siculus understood this vulnerability completely. He began his career as a legitimate argentarius. He built a reputation over years of reliable, unremarkable financial service. He cultivated relationships with senators, equestrians, and the kind of wealthy Roman families whose financial needs were large enough and complex enough that they required someone they trusted completely to manage them. And then, carefully, methodically, and with extraordinary patience, he began to exploit every one of those relationships. The core of his operation was document fraud. Roman financial and legal life generated an enormous volume of written documentation: contracts, receipts, estate records, loan agreements, letters of credit. These documents were the foundation on which Roman commercial law operated, and Herennius, with his daily access to genuine documents of every type, had developed a capability that no investigator of the period was equipped to reliably detect. He could produce any document perfectly. Legal historian Alan Watson, in his work on Roman private law, has analyzed the specific vulnerabilities in the Roman documentary system that someone in Herennius's position could exploit. Authentication of documents in the Roman world relied primarily on the recognition of seals, handwriting, and the testimony of witnesses. There was no systematic forensic examination of ink, parchment, or writing instruments. A document that appeared genuine, that bore the right seal, and that could be attested to by credible witnesses, was genuine as far as Roman law was concerned. Herennius had access to the seals. He had access to the materials. And over years of building his network, he had cultivated exactly the kind of witnesses who would attest to documents they had never actually seen produced. The scale of what he built was remarkable. Forged wills that redirected inheritances to confederates, fabricated loan agreements that created legal debts where none existed, falsified receipts that erased real debts from the record. Each individual fraud was carefully sized to avoid triggering the kind of scrutiny that larger thefts would attract. Each was embedded in a web of genuine transactions that gave it legitimacy. Historian Fergus Miller, in his work on Rome's legal and administrative systems, has noted that the Roman Republic had no professional investigative apparatus, no police force, no public prosecutors in the modern sense, no institution whose function was to proactively detect financial crime. Prosecution in Rome was a private activity. If you believed you had been defrauded, you found a lawyer and brought a case. And bringing a case against a man whose entire operation was built on the manufacture of exactly the kind of documentary evidence that Roman courts accepted as authoritative was an exercise in institutional futility. Herennius was eventually identified. Word spread, as it always does in a system built on personal relationships, that certain documents connected to a certain argentarius were producing unexpected legal outcomes for the people associated with them. But identifying the problem and proving it in a Roman court were two entirely different challenges. Every document he produced said the right things. Every witness he had cultivated said the right things. And the victims of his frauds were, in many cases, people whose own financial dealings were complex enough that disentangling genuine from fabricated records required exactly the kind of systematic documentary forensics that Roman law simply did not have. Classicist Jill Harries, in her work on law and empire in ancient Rome, has written about how the Herennius case, fragmentary as the surviving record is, contributed to a significant tightening of Roman procedures around the authentication of documents. New requirements around witnessing and sealing were introduced. The legal category of falsum, the crime of forgery and falsification, was expanded and clarified in the Lex Cornelia de falsis, which created new penalties for the production and use of false documents and brought a wider range of fraudulent acts within the reach of criminal prosecution. He did not just steal from Rome, he forced Rome to invent new law to address what he had done. This is the pattern you see across history when a criminal is genuinely ahead of the system designed to catch them. The institutions do not catch up to the person, they catch up to the method, and by the time the new law is written, the person who inspired it has usually already moved on, or, in Herennius's case, already operated for long enough that the damage was done and the full extent of it could never be fully untangled from the legitimate records surrounding it. You already live in a world shaped by criminals who are smarter than the systems of their time. Every financial regulation you have ever encountered was written in response to something someone did before the regulation existed. Every authentication requirement, every verification protocol, every document standard was built to close a gap that someone had already walked through. The most brilliant criminals in history are not remembered because they were caught, they are remembered because what they did changed the law. Herennius Siculus changed Roman law. And the Rome that came after him was more careful, more suspicious, and more legally sophisticated, precisely because he had demonstrated with devastating clarity exactly how much the system was willing to take on trust. He never needed to be in the wrong place, because in the world he built, there was no wrong place for him to be.